Everyone, this is Benjamin Day, and we are here on the Medicare for All podcast, the podcast for everybody who needs healthcare. And this episode, we are joined by the one, the only, Jillian Mason. Jillian, I think you were our very first guest on the Medicare for All podcast. Definitely our first guest host way back in the days. I don't know if you even remember anymore when we recorded this in a little studio in Somerville.
I put it all out.
Feels like a different world back then. We sat across tables from each other and
exchanging vapors.
I had no idea what was happening at the time. It was disgusting in retrospect, all of this human interaction. But you have left us from our little liberal cushions, and you are in Texas now.
I'm in Texas now, in Corpus Christi, Texas. Shout out to all my comrades here.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So we are going to talk today about drug advertising. And, in particular, probably everyone has heard by now that the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccine finally received full approval from the FDA. This is the very first COVID vaccine to, not have drug administration. And that actually means that they can now start advertising their vaccines, which they have been barred. It's illegal, has been illegal for them to do that. So get ready for a wave of advertising for the vaccines. But we thought this was like a good moment to start talking actually about the broader use of drug advertising that pharmaceutical companies, there are other really shitty, terrible drugs, which are good for some people, but bad for a lot of other people. So get ready to be flooded, airways to be flooded, social media to be flooded with ads. Well, you don't even need to say anything about the car that you're advertising. It's a little bit weirder with drugs when you're not mentioning what the drug treats, but that didn't stop them. They started doing limited advertising on television and radio without mentioning what their drugs were talking about. So this was, in the 1980s, the decade I would remind you that brought us Wake Me Up Before You Go, equal contribution to the world. And now that I've stuck that in all of your heads, it wasn't until 1997, which seems so recent, that the FDA started allowing pharmaceutical companies to list only like the major risks of drugs, not all the risks. But they had to mention where people can find a full list of the risks and side effects of the drug. And I had no idea that this is why this happens. But whenever you see a drug ad, you may notice that they're like, see our advertisement in Golfer's Digest or, these really obscure print magazines. And I never understood why these fucking things were in there. But this is why it's actually a legal requirement. They have to direct you to a full print advertisement listing side effects and risks of the drug.
The more you know, Ben, the more you know.
Yeah, and that's where you make the educated decision once you've read your Golfer's Digest or your Country Gentleman, whatever,
Well, that's where I go for my medical advice. And,
right. I feel like you can always tell what the pharmaceutical company executives read based on where they send you in these ads, right? It's like only rich people shit mostly.
Yeah. Big Yachts Magazine.
Exactly. And, the fact that I hadn't actually realized that they are not listing all the risks and side effects. I thought they were listing all the risks and side effects. These are only the major risks and side effects. But they are so horrible and terrifying and comically bad, even the limited stuff they have to talk about. I know you pulled up a couple of these, Jillian, like the after drug warnings.
Yeah, I'd love to tell you about a drug called Abilify.
I see this one all the time. I see this ad all the time. I don't know why I've been targeted.
I don't know. I know that I'm targeted because I'm taking several other drugs for depression, but whatever.
Have you considered switching?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because if you're on Abilify, you should call your doctor if you have high fever, stiff muscles, and confusion to address a possible life-threatening condition. Or if you have uncontrollable muscle movements, as these could be permanent, uncontrollable muscle. Okay. Anyway.
That sounds really bad.
High blood sugar has been reported with Abilify. In some cases, extreme high blood sugar can lead to coma or death. Other risks include decreases in white blood cells, which can be serious. dizziness upon standing, seizures, trouble swallowing, and impaired judgment or motor skills. I,
That's all.
one, I just want to point out that I think that they list these in a random order in order to kind of mask the more
Totally.
terrifying one. You know what I mean? So it's dizziness upon standing, seizures and death,
Right.
trouble swallowing.
And you know that during all of this, there's like really pleasant music and like really friendly people doing interesting stuff to distract the eye. But I have to say, my first takeaway after listening to you read that was, I think you should consider a career change, Jillian. You have an excellent TV voice.
Right? I know. If anyone's watching, I'm looking for representation.
Right. She could happily to read all the major risks associated and refer people to Golfer's Digest.
Good stuff. Oh man, Ben.
Yes.
All this comes back to the money, right?
Well, that is kind of what the healthcare system is about in America, unfortunately.
Sad. Hashtag sad.
Are you going to make that hashtag trend?
It's very 2016, I think. Anyway, so Ben did some research, and what he tells me is that big pharma advertising, direct-to-consumer advertising. So that's not even counting the advertising that they do to your doctors, which is like crazy and insidious, and send them on a cruise and give them a bunch of pens, and then they prescribe you their medicine, whatever. But so this is the direct-to-consumer advertising has hit $6.58 billion in 2020, which is up from $3.9 billion in 2012. Just to give a little context there, it cost Moderna $2.5 billion in order to make the what are they calling it? The Spikevax vaccine.
Spikevax. Right.
So this is a shit ton of money, and this doesn't even include social media or online advertising, which wasn't allowed before 2016 because of the complications with listing the side effects of drugs on social media. But the FDA has been allowing it. They found some way around it, and so now there's tons of big pharma on social media, including they got Kim Kardashian to shill for them.
No, say it so.
In 2015,
she would never.
They had to force her to take down a drug promotion post from Insta.
So you mean she was acting irresponsibly?
Okay, now, if you've seen Cooking with Paris on Netflix currently, I definitely recommend it. Kim Kardashian looks like really the responsible one. She teaches Paris how to use a dishwasher. I had great hopes for her,
Oh, they don't have people to do those things for them?
It's clear that Paris has a lot of people to do a lot of things.
I mean, I mean,
Kim Kardashian literally has to tell her what a blender is. But anyway, my point is that I get why these drug companies are trying to do this social media advertising, because I actually do trust Kim Kardashian more than a big pharma company. But obviously sleazy, obviously insidious.
Yeah, and I think that the reason that drug advertisement has now been even more recently been moving on to social media. I mean, that's been kind of a new development. It's because it's actually hard to list even the major side effects of a drug in a social media setting. I mean, imagine that whole paragraph that you just read about Abilify. I mean, there was possible life-threatening condition. There was uncontrollable muscle movements that could become permanent. There was high blood sugar that can lead to coma or death. And then there was a whole list of other things. Like, how do you do that in a Facebook advertisement, right? Or even a Facebook video, which everyone knows no one watches more than a few seconds of. Pay no attention to this, Facebook listeners right now.
It sounds then almost like Facebook is not the appropriate forum for discussing possible drugs.
In fact, none of them are. The doctor's office is really the only appropriate forum for discussing the drugs you should be taking. And so, but you can imagine, they've been coming up with things like streaming the side effects in small text along the bottom.
Yeah.
So they've only just now kind of innovated these ways that the FDA has started to accept to start advertising on social media. And that is now catching up with the TV advertisements, which we're already totally inundated with. I feel like I see almost only pharma ads and car ads and almost nothing else. So it's totally wild out there.
Yeah. I actually bought a newspaper rack to organize some of my magazines, and now Facebook thinks I own a convenience store, and they keep on trying to sell me snacks wholesale to sell at my
is
convenience store.
is that how few people have magazines these days? That's a
Yeah,
sad statement,
right.
isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. If you have magazines, you must
That's right.
be running a convenience store. Anyway.
Well, you can collect the magazines. Your partner has the massive CD collection that I was always impressed by.
Yeah. I like that we can just take this time. I mean, this is a healthcare now podcast, but it's about Medicare for all, but also just Ben and I haven't seen each other in
I
years.
know, it's really sad.
Whew, social contact.
Let's take a 20-minute tangent where we just talk about our lives. No, let's not do that. I think we might lose. I might lose my reputation as well as everyone listening to this podcast. So the last thing I wanted to touch on really was just as like an example of how dangerous the drug advertising is at its very worst. Look no further than the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic, which kills tens of thousands of people, is it's entirely prescription drugs, and it's basically a public health crisis that was manufactured and created by the pharmaceutical industry. They made these opiate drugs. They were used fairly rarely for very severe chronic pain issues, and tried to market them as as things that people can just use for sort of day-to-day pain. They said that they ran a public advertising campaign saying that pain is underutilized, and then they had all the shady shit to incentivize physicians to prescribe and to overprescribe drugs. So they're working both those angles. And the thing that really stuck out to me was that some of the drug companies that were most at fault for the opioid epidemic are exactly the same ones who just made the vaccines, which is kind of an awkward truth of how our healthcare system works. One of the ones that everyone focuses on, which is Purdue Pharma, which is like the OxyContin company, they filed bankruptcy. They went under. Everyone's trying to get a piece of their remaining cash to like help all the people who are affected by that crisis. But I didn't realize that there are these massive lawsuits that are happening right now that Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson are in the middle of all these settlements. They're being sued by basically every state in the country and many cities and many counties. There was just like in the last couple of weeks an announcement of a national settlement where they were going to give up billions of dollars in a settlement, including all these drug makers, including Pfizer, including Johnson & Johnson. But many states are saying we're not going to take this national settlement. We want more, and we're going to pursue our own individual lawsuits. So this is all happening right now, and it's all kind of hitting the news at the same time that their vaccine shit is hitting the news. So I have a feeling it's providing a little cover for their wrongdoing. But this is so neither Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson, they both had opioid products, but they weren't like the really, really big ones like OxyContin and oxycodone. But Johnson & Johnson, I found out, was manufacturing more than 50% of all of the opioid drugs that were imported into the country. And then they were just bought by Purdue and all the ones that we sort of know as the villains now, like the bad guys. There's this whole wild story. There's a write-up in the Washington Post about how Johnson & Johnson, basically they created this super poppy opiates made from poppies, just like opium was back in the day. And it used to be not very commercially viable to make opioids and to sell them commercially until they made this like super, super poppy that they were growing in Australia. So they had to invent that. And then they also had to lobby to change the importation rules to allow them to import drugs, opiates. And they did all that shit. And that kind of drove this massive opioid epidemic in the United States. So I have the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I feel a little guilty right now.
Well, I wouldn't feel guilty then.
Yeah. Well, I also tested positive 2 months after getting the vaccine. So fuck you people. I mean, I was asymptomatic, so it worked.
Vaccine hesitancy here.
No, that's true.
Throughout all of this, drugs are great. I think that like that's something that we should definitely say. And like, look,
Well put.
drugs are
I'm going to
terrific.
quote that out of context to promote the podcast. Drugs are
Eli
great.
Lilly, right? Who like made this shitty ad that I'm ranting about. They
Mhm,
also made Prozac, which is something that I take every
mhm,
day, right?
mhm.
And so, I believe in drugs, and none of it, that's not what we're saying, right? We're talking about these
Yeah.
drug companies, and the fact is that these drug companies are always the middleman, right? 95%, over 95% usually, of any drug, the money that goes into any drug becoming public actually comes from public money, comes from federal
Mhm.
tax dollars, comes from universities that get tax breaks, right? And so we are funding these, right? Moderna and Pfizer are not the heroes here, right? It's us, right? We paid for that vaccine, and now Moderna and Pfizer are going to go and make a shit ton of money out of it,
Making the cash.
and
Yeah.
Johnson and Johnson is going to be able to take cover for being opioid peddlers.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I didn't want to go over the top in my Johnson hatred. Everyone should get vaccinated, and I think it's also interesting to or important to talk about the difference between marketing or advertising a vaccine and advertising things like opiates or depression medications. I mean, the vaccine is appropriate for almost everyone, unless you have some underlying medical condition that makes it bad for you to take the drug. Everyone should get the vaccine. It's appropriate for everyone, and so it's hard to get all worked up about a massive advertising campaign to recruit people to take the vaccine. And in fact, we should be doing that publicly. I know a lot of states are doing public advertising, massive public ad campaigns. So is the federal government. If the drug companies want to do it too, I'm not upset about that. But that's not how most drugs work, right? Most
Yeah.
drugs are only needed by a certain subset of people. Most drugs, there are alternatives that could actually be more effective or could have fewer side effects. And the drug companies don't give a shit about that. They want you to take their drug, whether it's worse for you, whether you don't really need it or not. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. And that's where drug advertising, which is allowed and barely regulated in the United States, is so sort of dangerous and deadly.
Yes, insidious.
Yeah. So I think we're gonna wrap this up. The last things I'll say about this opioid litigation, which I hope people are sort of keeping an eye on and following the news about. This all started apparently the state of Oklahoma sued Johnson and Johnson, and they got a $500 million settlement for their role in the opioid crisis. And that followed a bunch of other states. So just let's see, it was just this past year that I think New York also. So there's the state of New York got a big settlement against Johnson and Johnson,
Mm,
and then there was just recently, a couple weeks ago, the news of this national settlement, which states and counties and cities can join or they can leave and sort of pursue their own litigation. But these folks are so dirty. The story of how this opioid epidemic went down is crazy, and advertising to patients is only kind of one piece of it. There's also they did all sorts of other stuff to create this crisis. But we really should not have advertising of drugs in our healthcare system. It's we talk about how our healthcare system is so expensive. It costs about twice as much for our healthcare system as any other country in the world, and this is a big piece of it, right? Our drug spending. And part of it is overuse of drugs that people don't really need, or using more expensive drugs when a cheaper drug would work just as well for you.
yeah.
But Jillian, thank you so much for joining the podcast, stepping in. Stephanie is away on vacation in locations unknown.
Yes. Have fun, Stephanie, on vacation. And much love and solidarity to all the folks in New Orleans and the surrounding areas right now who are getting pounded by the hurricane.
Yeah, we're really thinking of everyone. I just I was traveling through the South recently, and we got hit by 3 hurricanes, but none of them were as bad as Ida, which is hitting New Orleans right now, which
Yeah.
on the anniversary of Katrina is just insane. So
Yeah.
we'll be thinking of all our activists and everyone else in New Orleans.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, Jillian. We'll see you
Thank
all
you, Ben.
later. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.